Hi, this is Paul J. Bennett here, once again on a Facebook Live session, and I thought I would talk today about a little bit about, I've had people question me about character development, so I thought I would talk specifically in this case about character relationships. Um, in people don't exist in the real world in a vacuum. They they're married, they have friends, they have relations with other people, and that's an important part of writing in fiction as well, is to have well-developed characters. A lot of people tell me they like the characters I've developed, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the different kinds of relationships that I developed inside, specifically the Heart of the Crown, or pardon me, the Heir to the Crown series. Perhaps we'll do a future one when I've got a few more of the books in the Frozen Flame series. So, people in general, as they grow older, they develop more relationships. Anyone who's, young people will do this too, of course. For young people, they make friends in school primarily, whether it's later education like college or university or whatever. As people get older, they tend to make friends in the workplace or they meet through other social engagements. Obviously, if you're writing in a fantasy setting, some of this isn't going to apply, but still, there are many different types of relationships. Now, a lot of people, when they think of relationship in a book, they immediately think, oh, it's got to be someone in love with someone else. But even love has different kinds of love. And I'm not talking different kinds of physical love. I mean different types of loving relationships that they can have. In Servant of the Crown, the main character is Gerald Matheson, and he is an older soldier who's a bit down on his luck as the book begins, and he meets Anna. I don't want to give too much of the plot away, but basically, here you have kind of a unique relationship in the series because it's more of a father-daughter relationship. Although when I started it, at first, when he first meets her, he's more annoyed with her. He doesn't want this interference with his life, and this develops slowly over time, and he comes to love her like a child, he having lost his own child years before. Now, the series in general, when I wrote the series, I wanted to tell the story of people around the heir to the crown, but not told from the heir's point of view. Now, spoiler alert, the heir to the crown is Anna. I have to get that out of the way now. If you haven't read any of the books, it's not a huge spoiler, but it is something that's kind of out of the bag by now. You can get that just from reading the synopsis on the later books. So Anna is never talked about directly. It's always other people's interactions with her. Primarily Gerald, of course, but later on we get more into Beverly's point of view, perhaps Haley's point of view, and so on as the series progressed. And that was very intentional. Now, if you pay attention during the books, you can get a lot of feedback on what Anna is like, of course. That also is intentional. Now, Anna, of course, we can't mention Anna's relationship without mentioning her lifelong friend, Tempest. Tempest is a massive dog, a Carathian Mastiff, and this is basically the biggest unconditional love in the entire series. Tempest would die for her. He's loyal. He does get along with other people, particularly Gerald and eventually Haley. He develops a soft spot for. But this is also another type of relationship that we see. And it's an important one because it sort of grounds her. Tempest makes her feel safe. There is a reason for this. If you want to know more about Tempest's background, you have to read there's a short story inside Stories of the Past. It's all about Tempest, and it explains why he is so devoted to Anna. Okay, there's kind of hints at it elsewhere, but this tells the whole story. Of course, it's interpreted for you because it tells it in retrospect with the help of the druid Albreda. Now, moving on, we see a number of relationships develop in Heart of the Crown, and a very important relationship in, of course, Sword of the Crown in Book 2. So let me back up to Book 2. I guess I should do these books in order. In Book 2, we meet Beverly Fitzwilliam, and Beverly is meant to be a supreme knight, if you like. She is sort of the epitome of the Arthurian legend, or the legendary chivalric knight, even though she's a woman, whereas, of course, when you think of King Arthur, you don't think of women knights. But she is the ultimate fighter. She's dedicated. It's not, she's not someone who's born to greatness. She is from a from a noble family, but she's good because she trains hard. She works hard at it, kind of like a professional athlete would prepare for the Olympics. And so this is a person who's dedicated her life to her chosen profession. And yet, she has two relationships that are very influential and important to her life. First of all, of course, her father, and Richard Fitzwilliam, or Fitz as he's known, is a very strong influence on a number of people in the entire series. Obviously, he has a big influence on Gerald, who learned everything from Fitz, who's kind of like his mentor, and he passed along these sort of life lessons to Beverly. Now, people have said, well, Fitz is maybe a little too perfect. Well, he's meant to be that way. You can't get a perfect knight without a parent who is guiding her in that, but he wasn't always so. And there's a book that will be coming out in the near future called The Making of a Man that actually tells Baron Fitzwilliam's origin story. Now, we already know where he's born, of course. It's more about his coming of age and why he is the way he is. And of course, in order to get the most out of this, you have to be familiar with Sword of the Crown. There's many parallels between his background and Beverly's background. The other important relationship, especially going forward, is that between Beverly and the smith Aldwin. So here we have a scenario where they grow up together, not from little tiny children, but they're a little bit older, I think around 12 or so. I forget the exact ages. I do have it written down, I just can't recall it off the top of my head. And so this is a love that grows, and they both mature into it. And it's very important for Beverly, and it becomes a grounding point for her. To the point that when bad things happen to her, she is in one way more afraid of how will it affect Aldwin's opinion of her than she does about herself. And I'm not trying to make it so that she is reliant on him in any way, but she gives him strength, or he gives her strength. And his love, in a lot of ways, is unconditional. Right? He loves her no matter what. You'll see more of that in Burden of the Crown, actually. I won't tell you any more spoilers, though. And so that relationship is also important. And going forward, every book will mention that relationship at some point. Because to Beverly, when it's from Beverly's point of view, it is a very, very specific thing. It's part of the glue that holds that character together. When we move into Heart of the Crown, of course, the main relationship is between Anna and Prince Ulrich of Weldwin. But there's a second story going on in the background that is maybe a little more amusing. And that is between Haley, the ranger, and Revy Bloom, the mage. And Haley's character, I strive to make her a little more sort of easygoing. I won't say life of the party, but she's more, in some ways, she's more worldly. She's spent a lot of time as a ranger, traveling about, meeting other people. She's a lot more outgoing. Revy, on the other hand, although he can communicate with people, he is rather consumed by the passion of studying his magic. So that's a very interesting relationship. You would almost say it's a reluctant relationship in a certain sense, because Revy is almost too engaged with his studies to really realize it, although he starts to come out of his shell a bit more when we see him in not Burden, we want, where are we here? Shadow of the Crown, to keep my book straight here. And of course, that develops further on, and that also becomes very important in Burden of the Crown, which once again is due out shortly. So that's another relationship that I thought was very useful to develop, and different in a lot of ways from Beverly's. You know, there's a number of places in multiple books. Lives are different. The cultures are different. And so I wanted to show that contrast. Initially, when they meet, Ulrich's not too impressed with her. In fact, he's kind of annoying from his perspective. But by the end of the book, he's firmly in Anna's camp, if you like. The last one I'll talk about is Arnhem Castor and Nikki. Nikki the Knife, also called Lady Nicole Arundel. And they have a past. It's hinted at in Heart of the Crown. It's explored in more detail in Shadow of the Crown. She becomes actually very important to the series as a whole. You'll see why. She has some connections. But also you learn more about their past. It's not all bells and whistles. There are things in their past that have caused tension. And so I wanted to show, in this case, a relationship that was overcoming those kinds of struggles. So each relationship in the book has its own ups and downs. Some are played a little bit to comedic effect. You know, Beverly is very dedicated to to Alwyn, to the point that she's essentially blind to any other attention that any man might give her. And of course, we introduced Jack Marlowe. Someone asked us actually recently, oh, poor Jack, what's going to happen to him? You'll have to see. We have things in store for Jack. He's not just comedic relief, by the way. He does have some very valuable skills to offer to the series as well. And he's a very interesting character to have. So that pretty much wraps it up in terms of relationships. At some point in the future, I'll do another video and maybe talk a little bit about the characters in the Frozen Flame series, possibly maybe with a hint of some other series to come, but that's a discussion for another day. So I'm not going to make this a super long video this time, but I would like to illustrate the relationship between Gerald and Anna and how they support each other, and also Anna's relationship with some of the other members of her group. So this is from chapter 2. It's called The Gathering. To put this into perspective, the war is over. Anna has gathered together people in the Great Hall of the palace in order to address them essentially for the first time as the victor of the civil war that erupted and was resolved in Fate of the Crown. Fall 962 Mercerian calendar. Gerald opened the door just a little, enough to peer out through the assembled guests. "How does it look?" asked Anna. "Crowded," he observed. "You're the one that wanted the commoners invited, and they're packing them in as tightly as they can." "It's important," she replied. "They need to know that I'm doing things differently." "I think they got the message," said Gerald. "I only hope things don't go sideways. Crowds can turn suddenly without warning. I'd hate to see what would happen if this lot got upset." "They won't," promised Anna, "and I'm counting on them to keep the nobles in their place." He turned from the door to look at her in surprise. "You what?" "The nobles secretly fear the mob. They won't try a power play if the commoners are here." "It's a gamble," he said, "but I suppose you're right." "Are the guards all in place?" Anna asked. "They are," he replied. "Beverly is waiting for your arrival. I only wish we had more knights we could trust. The war may be over, but I can't say I feel safe with the Knights of the Sword guarding you." "I know," she said, "but we've had little time to do much of anything." "Nervous?" he asked, notice her wringing her hands. "Terribly," she replied. "I've never done this before." "Nonsense," said Gerald. "You held court in Summersgate when you took the oaths of the Carathians." "This is different," she defended. "That was all arranged ahead of time. When I go out there today, it will be the first time they hear of my plans. What if they don't like them?" "They'll like them, don't you worry. Now let's have a look at you." Gerald walked around Anna, fussing with the sleeve of her dress. "There, perfect," he pronounced. "There's only one thing missing." "What?" she asked, her voice squeaking out in fear. In answer, she stepped across to the other door, opening wide to reveal her maid, Sophie. "Did you bring him?" asked Gerald. "He's right here," Sophie said, then called out, "Tempest!" The large Carathian mastiff bounded down the hall, halting at the door to stare at his mistress, his tail wagging. "There," soothed Gerald. "Now you're all set." "I can't take Tempest with me," Anna argued. "He'll scare them." "Nonsense," he replied. "He's docile, and besides, no one's going to argue with you if he's present." Anna held her arms out towards Gerald, and the old soldier stepped forward, embracing her. He could feel her trembling and tried to soothe her. "It'll be all right, Anna," he promised. "We're all in this together." He waited until she gathered her composure before he let go. "Now let's get you out there, shall we?" She nodded her head in approval as Tempest took up his place beside her. Gerald peeked out into the great hall again and spotted Haley close by, their eyes locking for an instant as he nodded his head. The ranger whispered to the steward, and then the horn sounded, the chatter in the room tapering off into silence. "Announcing," boomed a voice, "Her Royal Highness Princess Anna of Merceria." Gerald opened the door, standing to the side as Anne and Tempest entered the hall. There were a few gasps in the audience at the sight of the great dog, but they were quickly drowned out by cheers. It seemed the commoners loved their princess. He watched as she made her way to the throne at the end of the hall, where Beverly stood with a line of knights and soldiers in front, facing the crowd. As the young princess approached, Beverly turned to bow in her direction and took up a position to the right of the throne. Gerald felt someone just behind him and turned to see Sophie peering over his shoulder. "Come on," he said to her. "Let's go inside and get a better view, shall we?" They stepped through the door, closing it behind them, and watched, mesmerized, as Anna took her place before the warrior's throne. She held her hands up in front of her to still the voices, and after a bit the cheering finally subsided. "Mercerians," she began, "we stand here today after a savage civil war. With that conflict concluded, it is time that we band together to build a new future, one free from oppression and corruption. As your new sovereign, I wish to make it clear that under my rule, things will change. When I first took up arms in defense of this realm, it was to protect the common folk, for without you there can be no nobility, or even royalty. It is the obligation of the nobles to look after the commoners, and I intend to do just that." She glanced toward Gerald, and he could see the sweat on her brow. He nodded at her, watching her take a deep breath, even as her left hand sought the head of Tempest. "As victor and rightful ruler of Merceria," she continued, "it is my duty and pleasure to reward those who have been so instrumental in our success. First, I call upon Lady Aubrey Brandon." There was a bit of a stir as the young mage pushed her way through the crowd to come before the princess, bending down upon one knee. "Be it known," Anna continued, "that from this day forth you shall be recognized as Lady Aubrey Brandon, Baroness of Hawkesbury." She waited a moment for the applause to die down, then continued, "Arise, Lady Aubrey." Aubrey stood, and Anna embraced her, exchanging some quiet words. The Baroness backed up, then turned and resumed her place in the crowd. "That's no surprise," muttered Gerald. "Wait, there's more," whispered Sophie. Gerald looked at her in surprise. "Really? Tell me." "Shush now," said Sophie, a wicked grin on her face. "She's about to speak again." Gerald returned his gaze to the ceremony. Now that Aubrey had returned to her previous position, Anna looked like she was seeking someone else in the crowd. Gerald noticed a smile appear on her face as she spotted Prince Ulrich. The young man was surrounded by a group of his own guards, many in commoners' clothes so as not to create a stir. Gerald knew that Anna and Ulrich would eventually marry, but they had both agreed that she must put her kingdom to rights first. For now, at least, Ulrich was just a friendly face in the crowd and a staunch ally. "I call on Haley Chambers," declared Anna. "What?" called out the ranger in surprise. Recovering quickly, she continued, "Yes, your highness." Haley had been standing with the other knights that formed the princess's guard, and now turned, moving to kneel before her sovereign. "Dame Haley," Anna proclaimed, "from this day forward you shall be Lady Haley Chambers, Baroness of Queenston." Gerald chuckled as Haley's eyes bulged, for even Sophie felt to stifle a laugh. "Well deserved," said Sophie, once she caught her breath. Haley stood to be embraced by Anna. Gerald wondered what the nobles thought of this, for he knew that King Andrew would never have touched the subject, let alone embrace them in public. Before the ranger was allowed to leave, however, Anna spoke once more. "In recognition of your new title and elevation to the ranks of the nobility, we entrust you with this coat of arms." Two servants came forth, bearing a covered shield. They held it up, facing the crowd, as Anna pulled the cover loose. The cloth fell to the floor, revealing the shield's heraldic symbol, that of a griffin. Even from the door, Gerald could see the tears in Haley's eyes. The young ranger gratefully took the shield, returning to the crowd and her mage, Revy Bloom. "And now," Anna continued, "with today's proclamations behind us, I have one more announcement. I call on every noble of the realm to assemble here in Wincaster by the end of the month to pledge their oath of allegiance. Word shall be sent throughout the kingdom that any who fail to show themselves without just cause will be stricken from the ranks of the nobility." She nodded to Beverly, who then gave a command. All the knights snapped to attention, guarding the interest of the crowd. The horn sounded once more as Anna left the room, heading directly for Gerald, who opened the door and followed her, along with Sophie. The young maid closed the door as Anna sat down in a nearby chair. So that's a teaser for you. Burden of the Crown, going live on Wednesday. Unless you want the paperback, you can get that right now. All right, that's about it for today. Next week, we will have another one for you. And the current plan is to talk a little bit about religion. And I'm going to use examples from my book to illustrate a few things. And I may mention a few other books as well. Thanks for coming.